Everyone dreamed of being the very best, like no one ever was. That very line is what defines the Pokémon franchise, one of the most popular media franchises of all time. Ever since the release of Pokémon Red and Blue for the Game Boy, everyone has played or at least heard of Pokémon. It's impossible to deny the cultural impact the franchise has had on people, practically enabling an entire generation of people to stick by the media franchise, whether it be collecting Pokémon cards.
Oh my god, it actually fucking happened! Oh my god!
Buying merchandise, or purchasing the mainline series of games. The Pokemon games are what fuel the franchise, with new and interesting Pokemon being introduced. Cards and merchandise can be made, and profit can be gained. Ever since the very beginning, all the way back to Pokemon Red and Blue, the games were released in pairs, and then a third game would be released later down the line. This was often considered to be a tradition when it comes to releasing Pokemon games. With the success of Pokemon Red and Blue, they released Pokemon Yellow. The same thing happened with Gold and Silver when Pokemon Crystal was released. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire saw the release of the critically acclaimed Pokemon Emerald. Diamond and Pearl had the masterpiece known as Pokemon Platinum released. This tactic of releasing a third game alongside the main duo was a safe move on Nintendo's part. It allows the developers to reuse assets from those games and produce a third game that would ultimately be the best out of both games. Although this well-known tactic would also tarnish the reputation of Pokemon by a bit, as from now on they'll be known for playing it too safe, but why go outside the norm if the formula already works? The Pokemon Company had gained a reputation from playing it safe, so nearly everything was to be expected from them. The year was 2011. Pokemon Black and Pokemon White had just been released worldwide, and everyone wondered what the next Pokemon game would be. People predicted the release of Pokemon Gray, a title that follows suit in tradition to having a third game alongside the release of the main games. But Pokemon knew this, and played off people's expectations. In a 4D chess move, the Pokemon Company had subverted all expectations when they announced the release of not one, but two new games. Nobody predicted this. I mean, how could they? The Pokemon Company, known to play it safe, had ultimately tried something a bit different. On October 7th, 2011, they released Pokemon Black 2 and Pokemon White 2, two of the greatest Pokemon games to ever exist. Pokemon Black and White 2 are part of the 5th generation of Pokemon games, developed by Game Freak and published by the Pokemon Company and Nintendo for the Nintendo DS handheld system. Although during this time, Nintendo had already released the Nintendo 3DS, meaning Pokemon Black and White 2 are the last Pokemon games to be produced for the regular DS line. They were first released in Japan in June of 2012, with the worldwide release on October 7th, 2012. Pokemon Black and White 2 are direct sequels to Pokemon Black and White. As a result, they reused assets from Pokemon Black and White and improved certain aspects of the game, such as improvements to trainer animations that Generation 5 had become known for. They also expanded on certain features, such as the X-Transceiver, making it relatively easy for someone to look at a Pokemon's weaknesses, ability, evolution, EV tracking, and I would say this is what got me into the competitive aspect of Pokemon. The games themselves act more as a continuation of the story and themes set forth by Black and White. Generation 5 had the theme of opposites, with conflict based more on philosophical differences rather than the nihilistic approach of complete destruction of all life set a generation prior. The Gen 5 legendaries were made to reflect this theme, with the box art legendaries consisting of an elegant white dragon in contrast to a masculine black dragon, the blue eyes white dragon and the red eyes black dragon, the dragon of truth, Reshiram, and the dragon of ideals, Zekrom. Whether you chose the path of truth or ideals is based on which game you would buy, of course, a choice of basing all decisions of the world on reality or possibility. Basically, in a nutshell, you're Neo and you've been given a choice, truth or ideals.
Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
I do like what the developers did, continuing the theme of opposites instead of producing a third game that would ultimately be identical to Black and White with a few changes in the story, or in the case of Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, the same games to Sun and Moon with very little changes. Now, from my personal experience, I played Black 2 before I even played Black, so in my initial playthrough, I didn't get the references to the original Black and White, since the references were really only there to act more as continuations to Gen 5's story. But once I played Pokemon Black, everything came into place. The plot of Pokemon Black and White 2 starts off like any other Pokemon game. However, it's been 2 years since the events of Pokemon Black and White. In the original Black and White, you chose from Hilbert and Hilda, and the theme of these games was resonance. So the new male and female protagonists the player would choose from are named to suit this theme, Nate and Rosa, because when combined, it sounds like resonate. However, unlike in the original Black and White, where the player starts off in New Vema Town, this time you start off in the new Asperia City, meaning you start Pokemon Black and White 2 on the opposite end of Unova. The reason for this comes from Takao Uno, who was a graphic designer for the Pokemon games that was put in charge to be the director for Pokemon Black and White 2 by executive director Junichi Masuda. Takao Uno wanted Black and White players to look at Pokemon Black and White 2 from a different direction. He also explained that he tries to play the game from the perspective of a newcomer, allowing new players to easily understand how the game operates. That's why, despite being a sequel to an already existing game, they still add tutorials and explanations about game mechanics that new players would need. Now, the games themselves are a welcome change to anyone coming off Black and White, allowing for a fresh experience even though you're playing through the same region. In addition to starting off from a new part of Unova, they also diversified the number of Pokemon in the region, allowing for more diverse team options. Black and White were often criticized for only having the generation's new Pokemon, meaning you couldn't use older Pokemon from previous generations. The game starts off like any other normal Pokemon journey. You start off in your hometown, you receive your starter Pokemon, and since it's the same region as Black and White, you pick from either Snivy, Tepig, or Oshawott. After you receive your starter, your rival Hugh, a person hellbent on revenge and wants nothing more than to unleash his rage, challenges you to a battle. After some exposition, you need to deliver him a town map, and immediately you're introduced to the villainous team of these games, Neo Team Plasma. Team Plasma is by far one of my favorite antagonists in all of Pokemon. They act as the main villains throughout Generation 5. In short, they're all hypocrites. They want to liberate all Pokemon, but at the same time, they steal other people's Pokemon to further their agenda. They're also written way darker than any other villainous team in Pokemon. That's why I like them. Now, to progress through the game, you have to receive your first gym badge with the new gym leader in Asperia City, and it's Sharon, your old rival from Black and White. These games introduced a few new gym leaders like Sharon. Since the player started off on the opposite end of Unova, new routes were introduced and towns and cities were created, like the new Verbank City, home of the second gym leader, Roxy. Now, I have a bit of criticism for the beginning portion of Black and White 2. The pacing for the early portions is a bit too slow for me. A great example is where you're literally stopped by Alder, the previous main champion, just for him to tell you how to use berries, and some dialogue about taking on all the gym leaders of Unova. Did I really have to be stopped just to be told how to use berries, when this dialogue could have easily been given to an optional NPC encounter? Another great example would be the Pokestar Studios side quest. After you beat Roxy, to get to Castelia City, home of the third gym, you have to visit Pokestar Studios and meet her father, and you have to help produce a movie. Now, this wouldn't be an issue if it were optional, except it's mandatory in order to progress through the story. I feel like this portion of the game is very forced, as it's only used to help introduce Pokestar Studios. Now, I do like the idea of introducing more content in the game, I just don't like it when you're forced to do it. Sure, we get some deep dialogue from Roxy's father about pursuing dreams, but I still stand by my point about the section being forced. After reaching Castelia City, you have to go through Castelia Sewers and battle against Team Plasma, and then you're introduced to a new character, Colress. Afterward, you battle against Berg in his redesigned gym. I do like the fact that the older gyms were redesigned. It helps keep the games fresh and engaging for players coming off Black and White. Afterward, when you head north to the 4th gym in Nimbasa City, you're properly introduced to Colress. To be honest, I feel as if the sewer portion was rendered useless with this very encounter, when it could have easily been removed and nothing would have really changed. On your way to Nimbasa City, you are introduced to the new Join Avenue. From my experience from Join Avenue, you talk to people passing by and introduce them to shops in order to level up the shops and Join Avenue as a whole in order to receive rewards. After exiting Joint Avenue, you reach Nimbasa City, which is home of the 4th gym, the Battle Subway, and the Pokemon musical. When you reach the city, you have to play against the 2 subway bosses. You battle alongside the male or female protagonist that you didn't pick from the title screen. Since I chose Nate during my playthrough, I received assistance from Rosa. To be honest, the Battle Subway bosses are probably the most forgettable characters in all of Generation 5. I've never really cared about the Battle Subway. While it is the battle tower for this generation, I just didn't see the appeal. As a result, the bosses were pretty forgettable. The Pokemon musical I barely ever touched. I tried it once and I didn't like it, and I never attempted the musical again. Now on to Elisa's gym, and I really don't like this portion. I always thought this portion was a bit time consuming. To battle against Elisa, you have to traverse through her old gym, but surprise surprise, she isn't there. So then you have to transition to her new gym. Although I think this portion was made this way because Elisa's new gym only had 2 mandatory battles. Now I fucking hate Elisa. Every time I play against her, my Pokemon, without fail, get paralyzed, which is very fair. Anyway, after you beat Elisa, you make your way to Driftvale City. Driftvale City is by far one of the most memorable places in Black and White 2. It includes the introduction to the former members of Team Plasma, the Driftvale Gym, where you battle against the gym leader Clay, and get introduced to the Pokemon World Tournament. In Pokemon Black and White 2, the cold storage was removed in favor of the PWT, a change that a lot of people, including myself, would say was an excellent choice. The PWT is a tournament where the player battles against a multitude of different trainers ranging from gym leaders to champions of different regions. This is the reason why the Battle Subway is often forgotten, because the PWT is a far more enjoyable experience. The PWT and the Battle Subway both offer battle points or BP as a reward, but the PWT is by far the more enjoyable option when grinding out for battle points, because instead of battling random trainers, you battle against gym leaders and champions. The game does force you to participate in the Pokemon World Tournament to progress through the story, but in this case, I didn't mind it. I always thought the PWT was a neat concept and I really had fun doing it. Afterward, you battle against Team Plasma again, and they reveal their plans of taking over the Unova region by harnessing the power of the legendary Pokemon. After leaving Driftvale City and exiting Chargestone Cave, you arrive at Mistralton City. Since you started on the opposite end of Unova, you need to make your way to the other side. That's why the player has to take on the 6th gym leader, Skyla, in Mistralton City, and if you beat her, you can take a plane trip to Lentimus Town and venture to the right side of Unova. You then make your way to Opelucid City, home of the 7th gym. I always found Opelucid City to be pretty different from the rest of Unova, and that's when I remembered I was playing Black 2, because depending on which game you play, it's either a high-tech city in Black 2 or an old town in White 2. But it also fits with the theme of truth and ideals, where if someone were to pursue ideals, they shape the world to their will, and if someone seeks truth, the world is the way it is. You cannot change the world. Essentially, the town is different based on whether it's influenced by ideals, meaning the city was designed based on what's possible, or the town is influenced by truth, and as such, it's stuck by tradition. After you battle against the gym leader Drake, you receive more information about the legend of Reshiram and Zekrom, how a single dragon was split in 2 because of 2 brothers' stubbornness to see who was right. But Drake also mentions the possibility of a 3rd dragon, Kiram, and if Kiram were to exist, it would be nothing more than a husk of the original dragon. Then, one of the coolest scenes plays, where Team Plasma freezes Opelucid City in an attempt to receive the DNA splicers, in which they were successful, and afterward, you have to make your way to Honolulu City and battle against Marlin, the final gym leader. Now, Marlin is probably one of the weakest characters in Generation 5. He doesn't really offer much in terms of the overall narrative, except for one instance. However, I get the feeling that the developers only added Marlin as a speed bump, since you're forced to play against Marlin not to receive your gym badge, but to progress through the story. After you receive all 8 badges, you have to fight against Team Plasma, before you can take on the Elite Four. Marlin appears in and offers dialogue about his philosophy on not blindly following the words of others. While on the Plasma Frigate, you find out Team Plasma has been using the legendary Pokemon Kyurem to freeze Opelucid City. Then you make your way to the Giant Chasm, where you must confront Ghetsis, the true villain of Generation 5. Ghetsis is quite literally a narcissist who perceives Pokemon as nothing more than tools. In the original Black and White, Ghetsis comes up with a plan to conquer all of Unova by fooling N and Team Plasma. The plan was to fool Unova by making trainers release their Pokemon, thinking it will help Pokemon in some way, kinda like PETA. Actually, wait, no, scratch that, PETA's way worse. The reason for doing this is so that no one would be powerful enough to stop him. I mean, how else are you supposed to stop a Pokemon trainer without Pokemon? Before you're frozen solid by Kyurem, Reshiram or Zekrom appears, depending on which game you buy, of course, alongside N. N is by far one of the best characters in all of Generation 5. He plays a major part within the story of Gen 5, with him being one of the major antagonists in the original Black and White, to him being a central ally in Black and White 2. Now, unlike Ghetsis, who thinks Pokemon are nothing more than tools, he believes Pokemon and humans are equals. N in the original Black and White was manipulated so that Ghetsis would be able to utilize his abilities and capture the hearts of humans and Pokemon, but him coming to save the player would ultimately backfire for him. Ghetsis knew that N would appear before him with Reshiram or Zekrom. He knew that in order to complete the empty husk known as Kyurem, he needed one of the legendary dragons, and what do you know, N has one of the legendary dragons. Since N was caught in a 4D chess move, one of the best scenes in all of Black and White 2 plays. When Ghetsis uses the DNA splicers on Kyurem, a battle ensues between Kyurem and the legendary dragon, Reshiram or Zekrom. Kyurem ultimately wins, and the legendary dragon reverts into their stone forms, and Kyurem begins to fuse with the legendary dragons. This scene is by far one of my favorite scenes in all of Pokemon because it shows the defeat of a legendary dragon and the rise of one of the most powerful dragon-type Pokemon around. The husk, known as Kyurem, has now fused its body with one of the legendary dragons, and it's now filled with either truth or ideals. Kyurem now possesses the power of the legendary dragons. After this shocking revelation that Kyurem has the ability to fuse, you have to battle against Kyurem in order to free the legendary dragon. Due to Ghetsis' staff, you aren't actually able to capture Kyurem, meaning the only way to progress is to defeat the legendary dragon. Now, the battle itself isn't actually that tough or challenging. It's pretty much just a wild Pokemon encounter, and since you're required to defeat Kyurem, you don't have to worry about its HP, so the battle itself is pretty easy, depending on whether or not you brought the right Pokemon with you. After you defeat Kyurem, releasing the legendary dragon, you have to battle against Ghetsis, one of the most difficult battles in the game, who, for some reason, has a level 52 Hydreigon. I know a lot of people have pointed this out, but I still find it pretty humorous that Ghetsis forced a Pokemon to evolve purely out of hatred. Afterward, you make your way to a torn up Victory Road and take on the Pokemon League. You battle against the same Elite Four members in any order from Black and White, and you finally make your way to the champion, who, the champion of Unova this time around, is Iris, something the game hinted at earlier. She's pretty difficult considering most of her team consists of Dragon-type Pokemon, and back then, Dragon-type Pokemon were pretty overpowered. After a grueling task of taking on every gym leader, the Elite Four, and the champion, your reward is being declared the strongest trainer in all of Unova. But that's not how the story ends. The game doesn't just stop with you beating the Elite Four and becoming the champion. No, because afterward, the real ending begins. After you beat the champion, Hugh's sister talks about a Zoroark at the end of Victory Road. If you follow the Zoroark, you make your way to the remnants of N's castle, where you can battle against N and his legendary dragon. When you defeat N, you complete the story story of not just Black and White 2, but Generation 5 as a whole. N is pretty much the central character of Gen 5, to a point where every event is either caused by him or in spite of him. After he lost, he completed his character arc where initially he was unable to see other people's perspectives, and after everything that transpired within Generation 5, he was finally able to open up to other ideas. To quote N, by accepting different ideas, this world creates a chemical reaction. So I met many different Pokemon and people and heard so much, and that's how my world quietly grew bigger. Because nothing is always black and white. You can't just reject other ideas and think your way is the right way. That's what the whole game was about. The old legend talked about two heroes thinking their way was the right way, and as such, the original dragon split in two. To further highlight this concept, I'll cite another quote spoken earlier by Clay that perfectly fits with the idea of understanding one another. There's always room for folks to grow and change, ain't there? And if you only go for what you think is right, you might end up rejecting all thoughts and opinions other than your own. That's mighty dangerous. And dangerous it is. People are stubborn and they think their way is right. And you see it all the time. People reject other thoughts and opinions for the reason they think their way is absolute and any other way is wrong. However, you cannot think like that because everything is not black and white. You have to find the middle ground and try to see the other perspective. You have to find the gray area and be open to other ideas other than your own. When N realized this, he completed his character arc. After the battle with N, he reverts his legendary dragon to its dormant form, where you must take it to Dragon Spiral Tower, the place where N revived his legendary dragon. A cutscene plays where the legendary dragon awakens and chooses the player as the hero in your quest for truth or ideals. Two heroes living at the same time, because for every dark, there's light. For every black, there's white. For every Hilbert, there's a Nate. Although the two legendary dragons are in direct opposition with one another, they cannot exist without each other. You're able to capture N's Zekrom Reshiram, depending on which game it is, of course. Then N informs you that Kyurem has returned to the Giant Chasm, where you can finally capture Kyurem. Now, during my initial playthrough, I literally had no clue how to capture Kyurem, so I reset the entire game and started over from the beginning. Only did I realize that you had to follow the Zoroark at the end of Victory Road. Seriously, I really did not know how to get Kyurem. I was pretty stupid as a kid, and I guess I just didn't want to read. Now, there is a bit to unpack when analyzing the post-game. After you beat the main story, you're able to visit areas of Unova previously unavailable to you during the main campaign. The post-game also includes the Black Tower and White Tree Hollow. The Black Tower and the White Tree Hollow are facilities that enable the players to play through floors of trainers to progress to the top. Since I played Black 2, I played through the Black Tower, and when playing through the tower, you're unable to use items from your bag, meaning you can't heal your Pokemon. To beat a floor, you have to play against the boss trainer of that floor, except they're locked behind a gate, and in order to unlock the gate, you have to find the gate trainers that open up the boss gate. Every time you play against a trainer in the Black Tower, they drop hints to where the gate or the gate trainer are located. There's 10 floors in the Black Tower, and when the player reaches the top, the final boss is Banga, Alder's grandson. Upon defeating him, you receive a reward, and it's either a shiny Gible or a shiny Dratini, depending on which version of the game you're playing. Now, I do like the Black Tower. Being able to just battle and have a pretty good reward at the very end is worth it in my book. In Pokemon Black and White 2, they also added new rewards for completing certain aspects of the Pokédex. When you finish seeing all Pokemon in Unova, you get to visit the Nature Reserve, where you can capture a shiny Haxorus. Now, when you capture every single Pokemon available in Generation 5, except for mythical Pokemon, you receive an item truly worth your time. In previous generations, the reward was some certificate saying you caught all the Pokemon in the game, so yeah, congratulations, I know you spent hours grinding to catch them all, so here's a piece of paper for all your hard work. In Pokemon Black and White 2, they added the most coveted item known to mankind, the Shiny Charm. I would say it's a pretty good reward for Generation 5. Now, from that overview of the game, Black and White 2 were more focused on the overall story of Generation 5, and while it is a good thing to have a deep and interesting story in a Pokemon game, I feel as if it's the only appealing thing about the Gen 5 games. One of the major criticisms problems is that the game is incredibly linear. I mean, look at the routes, it pretty much cuts exploration in favor of a better story, and even then, the plot was pretty simplistic. The narrative can be summed up as collect gym badges, beat the villainous team, catch the box art legendary, although in this game you had to defeat Kirim before you can catch him, beat the Elite Four and the champion. I felt a bit constricted since everything that transpired only happened for the sole reason that the game told you to go there, all for the sake of further developing the story. For certain instances, I felt as if your entire journey of taking on the 8 gyms was nothing more than an excuse to venture around Unova to fight against Team Plasma. Everything in Black and White 2 pretty much centered around Team Plasma, and I'm not sure whether or not interrupting the player's progress at every given turn is good. Throughout Black and White 2, everything happens because of Team Plasma. They're pretty important. As a result, they interrupt the player's progress. In my opinion, while I do like Team Plasma, I think they should have limited the number of times they appeared throughout the story. It would have greatly improved the pacing instead of halting all the progress I made just to go to the sewer. The plot for Pokemon Black and White 2 is very simple, although you can apply that logic to every other Pokemon game in the series, considering that's the formula they've used since the very beginning and will most likely be used to the very end. Not to say the games were bad because of the story being simplistic, I happen to really enjoy the story. It had a lot of touching moments, and it's what's appealing about Generation 5. It's probably the last Pokemon games that had this level of quality when it comes to storytelling. Nonetheless, the plot was pretty enjoyable, despite some grievances I have with the pacing of the game. It was an excellent story from an excellent game. After all that, is Pokemon Black and White 2 a masterpiece? No, because Pokemon Platinum is a masterpiece. But in all seriousness, it's one of the best Pokemon games I've ever played, and I know I kinda ragged on it a little bit, but I seriously love this fucking game. Every time I play this game, I get nostalgia for the days of me playing as a kid, looking at Asperia Lookout to see the vast Unova region. The story was incredibly rewarding to see events unfold, and the payoff was one of the greatest stories that ever spanned 4 games. It's unfortunate that these games are part of Generation 5, one of the most polarizing generations in recent memory, and people seem to trash on this generation for no real reason, although I'm not saying it's exempt from criticism, because most of the criticism made for Black and White can also be applied for Black and White 2. The game that favored linear storytelling rather than having the player explore is probably one of the most damning pieces of criticism the games have received. While it didn't necessarily innovate, it didn't need to. The greatest thing about Pokemon Black and White 2 was its brilliant story and satisfying conclusion. I'm pretty thankful because I got to experience one of the greatest Pokemon games ever made. But hey, that's what's brilliant about Pokemon Black and White 2.
To